My role here is nearly done. My last responsibility is to introduce you to our next moderator, Ilse Treurnicht. Ilse, who many of you know, has a bio that is so extraordinary, it would keep me talking for the duration of today's session. So let me just describe her as the current chair of the Public Policy Forum, and one of the more insightful thinkers at the intersection between technology, innovation, and labor market policy. Ilse, thank you, and I look forward to your session.
Thank you very much, Sean. Delighted to be here with everyone at this second Brave New Work conference, and particularly delighted to introduce our next keynote speaker, Shingai Manjengwa. We're really honored to have her with us today to share her insights on the incredibly important topic of race and the future of work. There's a lot of things that I could say about Shingai, but she is, among other things, a data scientist by profession. She's an educator at heart, and as an example, serves as the technical education specialist at the Vector Institute for Artificial Intelligence in Toronto. She's also an entrepreneur and CEO and founder of Fireside Analytics, which is a Toronto-based edtech startup focused on developing customized curriculum and programs to teach new data sciences and data analytics, coding, and so on to students of all ages, as well as executives and policymakers. For the parents in the audience, she's also an author, and her children's book, The Computer and the Cancelled Music Lessons, teaches data science to kids from age 5 to 12. Shingai grew up in Zimbabwe. She then did an undergraduate degree at the University of Cape Town in South Africa before completing her Master's of Science in Business Analytics at New York University's Stern School of Business. She started her career with Aztec Information Services in South Africa before coming to Canada, lucky for us, in 2014, and began the journey of Fireside Analytics in 2015. So we will have a conversation after Shingai's keynote presentation, so please start sharing your questions. But before I hand over to her, I must also say on behalf of Public Policy Forum that we're extremely proud that Shingai is the 2020 Public Policy Forum Emerging Leader Honoree. And we were very excited to celebrate with her in person at our annual PPF testimonial dinner in April, but a pandemic intervened. So we will find other chances to celebrate, but if I can just use this chance, Shingai, to extend our warmest congratulations from all of us. So welcome and thank you, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Ilse. All right, I'm just going to share my screen and we can get started. So thank you to the Public Policy Forum for your leadership. This hasn't been an easy conversation by any means, and it started with the murder of someone in the United States, George Floyd. So the fact that we find ourselves here in Canada having this very important conversation is a testament to leadership and courage. And that's the spirit that I want to employ or have us embody during this process and this presentation. All right, so I am going to talk about race and the future of work. My presentation is split into 3 parts. The first one, we're talking about technology and data science and AI. That's my background. And perhaps, unfortunately, you may learn something about AI and machine learning today. And then the second piece is around using that framework to understand our own learning models as individuals and as people in society. And then finally, we will talk about how that impacts the future of work. All right, so as you've heard, my name is Shingai. I wear a number of hats: data scientist, founder of Fireside Analytics. I've instructed business analytics and distributed file systems at a college level. I've developed a high school data science curriculum course, technical education specialist at the Vector Institute, and children's book author. And our claim to fame at Fireside Analytics is that over 420,000 registered learners have taken our online courses. So that's a bit about me. Let's start by talking about data and learning models. So training data. You've heard these terms thrown around: data science, machine learning, artificial intelligence. I'll just go through some quick fire definitions just so we're all on the same page. This is the framework that we're going to be using to understand race relations, and then ultimately to try and forge a way forward after that. So data science, if you ask me the definition, is the umbrella. And my definition is it's the process of ethically acquiring, engineering, analyzing, visualizing, and ultimately monetizing or creating value with data. That's what we're doing when we're doing data science. And if you look at this image, this is what it looks like in the wild. You've got some sort of data. These are JSON files, and you've got some computer programming tool, let's call it R or Python, but actually Excel is also a data analysis tool. And then on the other side, you've got maybe a story told with data that's ultimately going to move us forward in some way. So that's data science. And if you ask me, that's the overarching umbrella. That's what we're doing, because all the other buckets like machine learning have data as the foundation. Artificial intelligence has data as the foundation. So let's talk about learning. When we talk about machine learning, the way we think of it is we are using historical data to understand something in the present, and then to use that understanding maybe to make predictions about the future, such that if new information comes about said thing that we've used historical data to understand, then we have a framework. We have somewhere to go to retrieve information and say, oh, I understand this thing that's just come into my world because of my historical data. So that's the basis of learning. So at the most simplistic algorithm that we can talk about when we think of machine learning is regression, right? Linear regression. And in this sense, this is some data, US labor force statistics, and its participation in the economy starting from 2015. And so what we would do is we'll plot this information over time, and then we'll draw a line through it that tries to get in between each of these points of variation. And because it's mathematics, we can actually come up with a formula for that line, and we can use that formula as the basis for our prediction. And we can look at our model and say, how good is that line? Does that line really cut into those different data points very well? And we say, yeah, 0.57, this is always a percentage that R squared, and we can say, yeah, 57%, it's over 50, meh, it works. In the wild, actually, we've used 57% in some models, even though it seems a bit low. So that's our model, right? That's what we're using to understand the future. Now, what happens when we get a data set, sorry, a data point that challenges our learning model? So we were using this line, and we were somewhere between 62.9 and 63.4 on this metric, whatever the metric is not the issue. And then suddenly we get some sort of nosedive. And we did, because in March and April, COVID happened. And for a lot of our charts, a lot of our data sets, as practitioners, we are all trying to grapple with what's happened to our models, because what we thought was historical data we could rely on may not be useful in terms of predicting the future. So why does this matter? I'll give you an example which says that if I'm trying to predict something in the future and I'm using historical data, I've made the implicit assumption that my historical data somehow reflects what's going to happen in the future. So the distribution of my historical data matches in some way the distribution of the data that I'm trying to predict in the future. And when it doesn't, we call that data set shift. You don't have to remember that term, but I can tell you right now, as data science practitioners, it's something that's keeping us up at night, thinking about, do we have to retrain our models because COVID happened and it did that? All right, so that's one idea of learning, maybe the most simplistic form that we can start to think about. Next, it gets more exciting. When we start talking about machine learning and we really get into it, we start talking about different types of data sets. So images are data. How is it that images are data? Well, every image is essentially just pixels on a screen, and we can have an address for every pixel, and we can have a set of numbers to codify the color for that pixel. And if you put that all together, you end up with an image. So this data set that I'm working with is to predict this iris flower, and there's different types of iris flowers. There's Setosa, versicolor, and virginica, different types of iris flowers. When we talk about supervised learning, we are going to go and get some information about these flowers, and we are going to document it meticulously in a data file, And we're going to use that information to try and predict which type of flower is in our database. So this, for example, is the data set. I have gone and meticulously measured the sepal length, the sepal width, the petal length, and the petal width. And I'm going to try and use that information to understand that the next time I see a picture of a flower, will I be able to correctly categorize it as what I'm thinking? So when we talk about machine learning, typically the process is, we'll go in, this is our data set, and we'll chop it off. Sometimes we use 70-30 as a split, and we'll use 70% as our historical data. So that's what we're going to use to train our model. And then we keep the 30% aside so that we can test what we've trained, right? Because if we just train all of the data using the historical data, then we're not going to know whether that model is a good one or not. So we split it into 70-30, and we use 70% to train, and then we use the 30% to test. So when I refer to training data, I'm referring to the data that we've used, that we've gone and we looked at for all these different flowers, 70% of our data set. What were the lengths of the sepal width, the petal width, etc. And then we've using a combination of those lengths and widths, we come up with, okay, we believe that when it's a setosa flower, this is the range that you'll find the petal length, and this is the range that you'll find the petal width. And that's the basis of our prediction. So this now is an output of such a model. This is an open source tool called Weka, W-E-K-A, and you can run some kind of model where you'll punch in the type of model that you choose, you'll make your percentage split for training and testing, and then you'll run it on this data set. And the output you get looks like this. Don't worry about the numbers and the detail. I think the main thing that I want to focus on here is that we score the model. So this says 93.333%. What does that mean? That means 93% of the time when looking at the testing data, this model accurately categorized it as a setosa, a versicolor, or a virginica. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is machine learning. Okay, so that's it. That's the big reveal, and it's based on training data and testing data. Now, so we spoke about supervised learning, and that's when we've actually done the hard work of categorizing each of the features that we're interested in to diagnose the type of flower. And here you'll find what we call, ironically, a confusion matrix that says in this model that we ran that was 93% accurate, A was Iris setosa. We accurately predicted 13, but 1 was incorrectly classified as versicolor. Then when we go to versicolor, we see 16 of them were accurately categorized and none of them were miscategorized. And then you do the same thing for virginica. But sometimes it happens in life, real life, that we haven't done the hard work of measuring petal lengths and etc. So we just dump that data set of flowers into a model, and the model will do the classification for us. So we haven't said what's what, we've just said, hey model, can you find some categories in this data? And computers are fantastic, the models work really well these days. They accurately predict there's something over here, there's something over here, and there's something over here. Flowers might be a bit of a random example. Think of airlines. If airlines were to go look at all their passengers over a period of time and put them in some sort of categorizing or classification model, then they would quickly see, well, there's a bunch of people that book tickets way in advance, there's people that book tickets in the middle, and then there's people that book tickets maybe the day before. And out of this, they can come up with categorizations like, okay, these might be people traveling for leisure, they might be looking for lower prices, and these might be business class or business travelers who, if you need to travel for a meeting tomorrow before COVID, then you're going to be in this category, you'll buy that ticket no matter what the price is. So that is what we call unsupervised learning. All of these are different ways that computers learn, that our algorithms learn. Where am I going with this? Well, it gets more complex than that, because we actually have advanced models called neural networks, which we don't have to put a hell of a lot of information into this model at all. What we would put, perhaps in this case we're using images, is a sequence of images, and we would put them into what we call our neural network. We have an input layer, Literally, these are called hidden layers because I'll touch on that in a moment. And then we have output layers that can accurately categorize what the image is. So what's the industry application? Well, think of something like Facebook. When you upload a photograph, Facebook has now become so good at using its facial recognition tools that it will say, hey, this is Shingai in the photograph, right? But we also know that it happens that our models get it wrong. Sometimes our models get it wrong. The learning data that we've put, the training data that we've put into our model can sometimes just result in something erroneous. This photograph was taken in Germany at the G20 Young Entrepreneurs Alliance. I was representing Canada with fellow entrepreneurs, and we went to the Centers of Excellence where there was a demonstration of different types of technologies. And as we walked in, there was a facial recognition system, and it would pick out individuals and make some sort of prediction about, say, gender and age. This was so good that when you walked in, it was picking out my colleagues in the back of the room. You can't even see some of the boxes. But when I came in, it didn't recognize me. Okay, just nothing. I could have done star jumps in front of that camera and absolutely invisible. Why? Because if we look at the training data set and speaking to the folks that run the center, it became apparent that there weren't any people that looked like me in the training data set. So in that instance, what do? Well, you realize very quickly that there's something wrong with your model and you try to correct it. And sometimes you actually arrive at the conclusion that the model is broken and you need to start from scratch, retrain, and get a new data set. All right. The conclusion from this is that it happens that our training data sets lead us astray. That's just part of the deal. When we're learning, we have to have the flexibility to think about what happens when a set of training data leads us astray. And we score. That's one of the most important things because we need to know the outcome. We need to be able to measure whether our model is working well. Race relations. All right. In South Africa, I was working in data analytics, and we went to a client. It was a dairy client. I was analyzing point of sale on behalf of retailers and manufacturers, and then we do these analyses and then go present to the client and give them insights about their business and perhaps help them move forward in their business objectives. I walked into this meeting, and as I'm putting my bags down, fellow colleagues walked in. They were all white, and someone from the client said, oh, can you just, I'll take a coffee, no sugar, no milk, right? The assumption was you're the person making tea in the room. Now, there are many ways I could respond to this. This is at this point. If we take this person's learning training data, their learning model and their training data up until this point, independence in South Africa was 1994. Shingai is showing up in 2007 or 8 to do this presentation. Perhaps to that individual, the only Black people they had ever encountered were people that were, working in the home or working in the garden. So based on that learning model, this is consistent when they see me that, oh, obviously Shingai, this is what they must be doing. So I then say, actually, I'm going to quickly get set up for my presentation. He's embarrassed, realizes his mistake, and, we just move quickly past the point. Now, what does that do for his learning model, right? Because I'm anomalous as far as he's concerned. Well, just as we've been talking about machine learning models, we have to, for ourselves, make the decision that I'm actively changing my model. I am actively updating my learning model to accommodate what has just happened in my world and to acknowledge it and to move on after that, knowing that there's a class that was previously underrepresented in our learning model. For me, Shingai, look, I grew up in Zimbabwe. Our parents did a very good job of insulating us from, race issues. Independence in Zimbabwe was 1980. I showed up in 1983 and, went to a mixed race school. So for the most part, I filed it under, hey, this is, he misclassified me, it happens in life. And up until that point, my learning model, my training data of white people is actually really positive, right? Because my teachers were white, the education system I was in was predominantly white. The history we learned was white conquerors and white heroes. Shakespeare's amazing. So, you know, as far as I'm concerned, I'm going to give this person the benefit of the doubt because white people are generally good as far as they've been framed in my learning model. The training data I'm referencing is generally positive. What does that mean for a Black South African person who encounters the same individual? What does their learning model look like for relationships with white people, right? So they've previously been oppressed. We have the history of apartheid. This is 2008, so that person lived through apartheid. If independence was only 1994, they have clear, vivid memories of what's happened in the past, and perhaps their impression of white people is, you know, suspicion, mistrust, etc. So when this data point comes into their learning model, it might just push down the whole thing. And when we start to see the R squared of that model, it actually becomes virtually useless, right? Because this data point is so far from everything else that someone has seen that it may push them either up or down in different ways, depending on whose training model, whose training data we're looking at, depending on whose model we're looking at. I like this, this approach because it takes away from the, you know, the labels, racist, blah, blah, blah. It's irrelevant. Even the unconscious bias argument, you know, I've done a number of unconscious bias trainings, and I'm wondering where's the racial revolution of trying to get representation? And I mean revolution sincerely, because if we've all done the unconscious bias training, then where's the activity? Why am I not seeing it? I'm seeing some, but certainly not enough. And the events in the United States have been a catalyst for Canada to take a harder look at some of our activities. And in some ways, we don't get to sit back and say, oh, this is a problem of the United States. I've developed this exercise. These are my questions. I crowdsourced them and tested them with some willing participants this weekend. And the point is to get folks to think about your learning model. You've got to think about your learning model. What has gone into your training data that is now informing the predictions that you make? Now, we've been very careful to exclude race and racial categorizations in Canada. I think it's because we're an evolved society, I guess. But unfortunately, that takes away from the conversation. When you take race off the table, that means I cannot raise it with you, even though it's a big part of my life, and in certain circumstances, I am affected by those categorizations. So here's a series of questions. I'm also gonna put them on my website. I'll share the link at the end of the process. And I'll just go through them now. And I hope that you take a moment and really try and think about what these questions mean. All right, in 2019, on how many occasions did you host Black guests in your home? So if you've got a pen and paper, you can make just quick notes on the side. And then at the end or during, I'll talk through some of my logic of what these questions mean. And I'm talking about Black because this presentation is specifically about race relations, but you can insert previously marginalized group in there to try and understand your training model with regards to that particular group. So, you know, one might say, have you hosted anybody from Indigenous communities in your home? That's a good question. Have you hosted anybody with a disability in your home? That's a good question. So think of it as a tool that's really trying to get you to reflect on your training data set. Consider the children in your life. How many close Black friends do they have? So it might be your kids, nieces, nephews, grandchildren, etc. In your hobbies, sports, book club, leisure activities, how often is it that there are no Black participants? So you might say, well, Shingai, I live in the Northern Territories. They just aren't any Black people. These questions don't really apply to me. It doesn't mean anything. My training model is based on where I come from. That's fine, that's fair. In the last 3 months, how many movies, TV series, or books have you watched or read in which the protagonist was Black? All right, so this has nothing to do with where you live necessarily, right? If we're curious, interested people, how is it that it might be that you haven't really watched a movie or a TV series or read a book in the last 3 months that involved a Black protagonist? Because in my world, it's almost a default setting that the protagonist is going to be white. In your most recent interaction with law enforcement, even briefly, what, if any, tactics did you employ to appear as non-threatening as possible? To appear as non-threatening as possible. And if the answer is none, then you're betraying some insights about your training data set. You're telling me about your relationship with police. And then that comes with the realization that that is not the case for everyone. Do you personally know any Black person involved in criminal activities? Now, this was the most hotly contested question in the list because, you know, somebody's feedback was, Shingai, you're perpetuating stereotypes. And valid point, I take it, but this is a part of my world. That's why I have tactics to appear non-threatening to police. So I didn't create that. That's in our world. Let's look at our media. What are the portrayals of Black people? Even in the movies where you find Black people, what are the portrayals there? If it's not an athlete, a rapper, then it might be in some sort of criminal scenario. And I'm not making this up. The research is well documented, and we're starting to have this important conversation now. And if the answer is yes, honestly, that's part of the data set, right? It feeds, all of it is feeding into our training data set, and we just have to have an awareness of where our framework comes from. Can you name a Black business leader, C-suite level in Canada, who you admire? You know what, at this stage, you don't even have to admire them. Can you name one, right? And how many of your teachers, college or university professors were Black, right? So what are your associations? So I said to you, I have quite a positive association because my teachers, my professors, most of them were white. So do you have any kind of correlation with Black people and intelligence? Perhaps, perhaps not. Again, it comes to your training data set. When was the last time you gave tough and caring feedback to a Black colleague? Have you ever caught yourself thinking a Black colleague was not a good fit in a particular context, right? That word fit, where I come from and in my experience, that's been used as a code for, what is, right? Can we define that and dig into the training data sets to come up with what are the pre-assumptions that result in that feeling? Have you ever hesitated to engage with someone because you struggle to pronounce their name? Well, the evidence and the data shows that when it comes to CVs and hiring, just on the basis of name, folks don't get pulled out of the pile. Can you remember a time when your immediate unconscious reaction towards someone from a different race left you mentally embarrassed? Have you ever made an assumption about a group that turned out to be wrong? That discomfort, right, is what we're trying to get to the heart of. Do you consider racism to be a big issue in Canada? The answer could be no. And again, you're telling me something about your training data set. Do Black Lives Matter? I really want to take a moment to be deliberate about these things. It's not a foregone conclusion. We think it's a foregone conclusion because it's filed in the database and we're used to it, and the training model is just driving all these decisions and predictions that we're making. But I think it's a moment in time that we can actually make a conscious, take time to be conscious and make a decision and think about what we really believe. And then lastly, if you believe that Black Lives Matter, given all that we've seen in the last few months, are there any efforts that you've personally taken to try and make a difference when it comes to racism? All right, so happy to share those questions. It's an exercise to get us thinking about our own training data sets. Now, this next piece is really just about the definitions, right? It's prejudice is when we talk about prejudgments. Discrimination is when those prejudgments then come into action. And then I think the last piece I want to tackle here is this systemic racism, right? Because systemic racism occurs when a racial group's collective prejudice is backed up by the power of legal authority and institutional control and technology. Because whatever's happening in the physical world, when we put that on the internet and we make it digital, that is a fire hose to all our feelings and sentiments. And we're seeing it already, right? And we've got these recommender systems that are carefully passing us out to get more of the same information that we already have. So it's actually feeding into your training model, your training data set, that you're going to keep getting the same type of information and the same views that you have got before. In Canada, we know that this is an issue. So our training data sets, and if you ask anybody, everybody will tell you Canadians are lovely people, very polite, fantastic. But then when we look at the data, then it begs the question that how is this happening? And I would posit that this is happening because of the training data sets that people have that have never been explored. And because we don't have these comfortable or easy conversations about race, forget comfortable and easy. We don't have conversations about race in meaningful ways, then this happens. This is a really powerful report from the Peel District School Board, and it identified that Black students were more likely to be suspended than non-Black students. So Black students were only 10.2% of the secondary school population, but approximately 22.5% of students receiving suspensions. Imagine that. These are students, right? They're not really, they haven't done anything. They're expecting the system to look after them and give them a positive response. But when they enter into a system, into an education system, what does that do for the training data set of a young Black person in this country? What does it do for their ambitions? What do they expect when they enter the world of work if these are the experiences that are cumulatively happening to them at a school level? And one of the interesting insights that came out of that report is the absence of demographically representative staff in schools, right? So I spoke to you about my teachers predominantly being white teachers and educators. Remember, they all have training data sets that they are now using to make decisions in the classroom. Imagine a classroom full of students and you ask a question and a number of hands shoot up. Your training model is hard at work in terms of who you decide to answer the question. And this is not a direct criticism on any individual. I'm hoping that we can take this on board and really start to be conscious about our own actions. Black Canadians are employed at a lower rate and earn less. So unemployment rates are higher for Black people in Canada. And when they're employed, they tend to earn less than other Canadians. Again, this is the reinforced message that's the training data of the Black experience in Canada. So if you have somebody who said, no, I don't believe racism is a big issue in Canada, and you talk to a Black person in Canada and they start telling, well, my experience at school and then my experience when I entered the job market, it's chalk and cheese, right? So we now have to adjust our models. We have to change the way we view the world because it's not representative of the entire population. All right, so the future of work. What's happened in the United States and what's happening in Canada and actually all over the world is this is a moment in history that's a call to action like we've never had before. And it's to change the face of the future of work. And I'm going to personally confess, when I do work in the future of work, and I've typically focused on the technology piece. I've typically focused on the training and education side, how we get technology skills into schools. I want every high school student to learn data science. That's been my approach. But thinking about it, in a city like Toronto, where 8.9% of the population is Black, the disparities we have are just going to be permeated into the future. So what's the solution? We're saying it's a call to action. What are the actions? What needs to happen next? Well, 3 things: education, introspection, and action. So the education piece starts with this conversation. Start thinking about your training model and how it works. You can take the questions, have some conversations with your friends and colleagues, have conversations with your children and the children around you. Because if we're not preparing them for a world that is actively more diverse, that is actively more representative and inclusive, that represents Canada as it actually is in numbers, then we are setting them up to have this revolution in the future of work. And this is our time. This is happening on our watch. So this is a moment in history that is a call to action like never before to change the face of the future of work. The other actions are set targets, track diversity data, and link diversity success to remuneration. And I expect the unions to be on board with this, right? Because why wouldn't they? We want to have a representative workforce, and let's put these targets 5 years, 10 years time. Can we get in 10 years time or in 5 years time, 8.9% of the population at a board level in different companies to be Black? What would that take? And immediately, if you get folks saying, Shingai, there aren't enough Black people in XYZ, blah, 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 then we need to do the hard work in building that pipeline. It won't build itself. And once we have those as targets and goals, then we can actually invest in those pipelines, knowing that in order to achieve that representation in 5 years or in 10 years, that we are on track to achieve that, we've put in the measures in place. And then the last piece is get involved and inspire, right? Because these training data sets, these learning models that are happening in our lives and in the lives of young people in schools today need to be interrupted. If we've all showed up today to say that we want to learn and have this conversation, then we need to be part of interrupting these training models or training data sets that are just running in the back of our minds. So I encourage you, I always give homework. I educationist at heart, I always give homework. Go to the high school that you attended. Go to a high school near you and give a talk about your career, the opportunities that exist, and make sure that everybody in that room knows there's a place for them in those roles, in those careers, and in those jobs. And if you're in a leadership position, make sure that everybody in that audience knows that there's a role for them in leadership positions in those organizations as well, regardless of their race, regardless of what they look like. So education, introspection, action. I've got a recommended reading list here. I'll just quickly run through before I hand back to Ilse. Race and Class and the Ruins of Empire by Akala. I've actually just labeled them in terms of what's involved here, why I think it's an important book to read. The first few are race relations based, and this is all about really starting to change our training models. And does your training model need to be changed? Well, think about where your data came from. Think about the data that's informing your training model right now. If you haven't had real interactions with Black people or Indigenous people, then yes, you do need to start filling your head and your training data set with new information. Right, so these first 4 books about race relations. Factfulness is just a fantastic book. Hans Rosling is just fantastic because it's ultimately a data first book, and it teaches us about the math. Right, we're interested in how do these things happen, right? And how do we interpret data? How do we interpret statistics? Where do some of our underlying beliefs come from? The Art of Possibility, this is nothing to do with race, it's all about leadership. And I like this book because of one of the main key takeaways that I took from it was everybody wants to make a contribution. So whatever judgments you've made, and maybe they're invisible to you, when you interact with an individual in particularly a work environment, everybody wants to participate, everybody wants to make a contribution. And if they're not, then we need to understand why that's the case. Six Sigma process improvement. Howard Gitlow was my professor at NYU. Management and processes, this just makes us all better at our jobs. So if we say that we're going to be tracking these metrics to try and get a representative workforce of the future, then we need some processes and to get better at doing that. And that's a great book to get us there. Born a Crime, Trevor Noah. Hell of a funny book, incredible story. And because I lived in South Africa and in Cape Town, I can tell you it's incredibly authentic and really well written. Americana, one of my favorite books, and it's a story of many Africans who immigrated to particularly North America. Very insightful if you're just looking for a different perspective. And then lastly, The Computer and the Cancelled Music Lessons. It's a children's book about data science. All right, and then I do encourage everybody to have a look at that Peel District School Board report because it's very insightful. And then you also walk away with what they did to try and address issues of race within the board. And I'm really looking forward to the next report that comes out to see how far they've come. And with that, thank you very much for your time. Thank you for listening. I think I'll hand back to Ilse and see if there are any questions.
Thank you very much, Shingai. You've really given us an incredibly compelling and thought-provoking framework to think about, not just where we are today, but how to think about what this means for us personally, but also I think for what it means for us or as organizations, whether we're a nonprofit or a big corporation or somewhere in the public sector. I love your homework too, so thank you very much. Hugely impactful. I have so many questions, and I know our audience has many questions too. So maybe we'll just have time for a couple. And I think that the one that sticks in my mind is just you sort of working right at this crucible of all these forces of the brave new work world, technology, obviously education skills, economic dislocation, and the pandemic, and you know, the renewal of race protests at a scale I think we haven't seen in recent memory, all at the same time. How have the last few weeks kind of shaped or influenced your thinking, not just about what your organization is doing, but where you want to spend your time?
Yeah, the last few weeks have really highlighted to me, and I mentioned it in the talk, that I was so focused on the skills and the tech side of it. And we already speak a lot about you know, bias in tech. I showed you the slide where the AI didn't recognize me. And normally when I put that up in a talk, I always talk about, well, if you put that in a self-driving car, that's going to be, you know, terrible outcomes for me and people that look like me, etc. And I've always focused on the tech. Now I'm really focused on what does the face look like, because the types of interventions that we're going to need to get there are not passive interventions. We are going to need leadership on board. We're going to need unions on board. We're going to need individuals on board to say, okay, in a city where 8.9% of the population is Black, where is the representation in the boards? By what year do we want this done?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so obviously all these developments have also had a very profound impact on the young people that you interact with. So any advice for them and for the young people in our audience today as they think about the just almost overwhelming complexity of what's ahead?
I think treating your brain as a file system is a very useful approach for me. My brain is a filing system. So when a new piece of information comes, if I already have training models running in there, then it's just going to automatically get filed somewhere. If it's something new that I'm encountering that I didn't know before, then I have to make a conscious decision about which file to put it in. And then occasionally something happens like Tiger King that I don't know where to file it. Right. Mm-hmm. So I think being deliberate about where you file things and really thinking about how your mind is working and how you're approaching situations, being that mindfulness that's more active than passive, to me is a very important thing that I don't think we teach young people. And then look at the math, right? This ends up being a logical thing that if we say we want representation, okay, let's take the steps to do it, and then let's put some numbers and track them, and then let's attach it to remuneration, and then after 5 years and 10 years, is it done? Yes, no, why?
And what advice do you have for the non-tech folks who maybe don't train their brains as filing systems, but we need them desperately? How do you think about that that collaboration?
So I think the non-tech folks, I'll go back to my technology lens, is we need them now more than ever. Because the historians have seen a lot of these movies before. In fact, it's the historians that are now standing up and saying, okay, well, when we saw, you know, the civil rights movement, this and that happened, et cetera, et cetera. And I don't know that that's necessarily being translated into the digital world in meaningful ways, mainly because the people that are developing technology are from a computer science background or an engineering background. So for what you're describing as non-tech folks, we need you at the table. And maybe it'll be me to create that space, but maybe it will be you kicking down the door to say, hey, I need to be at this table because we need historians, we need linguists, we need social science people looking at the digital world, so that when the future comes, and I know much of it is here, thanks to COVID, we're all doing conferences virtually, but when the future comes, those voices have been brought forward with us.
That's terrific. Shingai, we could talk for hours, but I'm cognizant of time, but I have to say I can't think of a better way for us to wrap up day one of the Brave New Work Conference. We're incredibly grateful to you. So thank you very much for your time and sharing so generously your insights. Much appreciated. And you and some of the other speakers have also set some great context, I think, for what's ahead in the next 2 days. Tomorrow, did bad just get worse for some workers and learners in Canada? And we'll particularly look at the barriers facing women, racialized communities, gig workers, and more. And then on Thursday, day 3, we'll try to look at the bright side and look at you know, where are new possibilities emerging, and we'll hear from a range of people from the business community, post-secondary education, as well as the federal government. These are such tough challenges in very uncertain times with deep impacts on Canadians across the country, and of course for our shared social and economic prosperity. And we need folks from all of these different communities and different cohorts of higher education, employers, civil society, policymakers, to have this important and interconnected conversation. And we know that frank and open dialogue is absolutely critical to generate the policy innovations that will help us create the future we all want. And I know that the Public Policy Forum is deeply committed to continuing its role as a convener of that dialogue through its Brave New Work initiative. So thank you very much for joining us today. And Andre, over to you.